Yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. So again, I'll give a quick introduction of who I am here in just a second. But I think today's webinar topic is going to be the ultimate playbook to running scholarships, and it's a very broad term because we've done these types of webinars in the past, and we have some online resources I can share out afterwards. Where the playbooks can start as early as web presence and marketing tactics and things like that. But I think the main goal I want to cover here today is what I feel is the most important aspects that at the end of the day, we can hang our hats on and say, yes, this scholarship campaign or this program was a great success. And a lot of that comes down to not necessarily like the marketing of the programs, but it's more so the experience. And what I mean by the experience is both the applicants or the submitters experience, but then also your volunteer, your board members, your stakeholders, your donors, your sponsors, and things like that. And how do we kind of build the snowball effect from one year to the next where these programs continue to grow and grow, not necessarily from a monetary perspective or from a volunteer perspective, but just the reputation behind them. And at the end of the day, I would say that probably 95% of the people on this call are mission-driven organizations. And so how do we just kind of continue to elevate the mission of these programs? So with that said, the kind of core items I want to talk through here today, and again, if there's things that you want to kind of review as far as your scholarships go or workflows, do toss them in the chat and we can kind of try to incorporate that. But number one is I'll give a quick introduction of who we are, like why are we even qualified to have this type of conversation. Number two is I want to talk about what I call a proof of process. I think it's a very underrated component that goes into a scholarship that really sets the tone for the entire campaign from a compliance perspective, from an engagement perspective, setting expectations, things like that. For a lot of you, it even might be a legal requirement. So we'll review some of that. I want to dive into the actual application structure. So we'll review a sample application form, but kind of the core elements that go into that. It's going to be how to collect data the right way. That's both safe, secure, compliant. How do you collect information in a way that lowers the barrier for the applicants so they can stay focused on their content creation and less so concerns or worries about other things that might be going on. We'll run through an example application form, obviously, but also I want to spend some time talking about things like reference requests. It's a topic that's become quite popular in the scholarship provider space of not just how to do them correctly, but also kind of the data security with those. And then we'll dive into kind of the nuts of the conversation, which is going to be the selection experience. So how do we ensure a fair, non-biased, compliant review workflow where, it promotes objective reviews, we leverage quantitative scoring, again, looking at real examples. So with that said, real quick introduction. I'll spend maybe just a minute or two on this of who we are at Reviewr, why we exist, and really kind of comes down to a story time. So, been doing this now for about 12 years, which is actually very hard to believe at this point. But, our background comes probably from very similar places, many of you on the call. So working very heavily with mission-driven organizations from a volunteer perspective. So when I say mission-driven organizations, we're involved in what I call funding opportunities, so scholarships, grants, investments. And as a volunteer review committee member, 12 years ago, platforms like us didn't exist. And so most of these campaigns were done through, believe it or not, physical binders. So we had, binders being mailed to our doorstep, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of being sent to us. If there was 15 or 20 other review committee members, we're talking about 20,000 copies of paper at that point in time. And for us as a volunteer, it was extremely overwhelming, right? Pen and paper and binders. But for us, the challenge that we ran into is more so from the experience of the applicants. For a lot of these campaigns that we are reviewing applications for, you could draw a clear line of who is going to get some type of funding and move forward. And quite frankly, the people that got funding were already well on their way to success. And so for us, we were trying to offer insights and feedback into why we were selecting people the way that we were in hopes that they could take that feedback, have some type of self-development, some type of self-growth, and that they don't get selected. How do they kind of move forward, applying with different providers, reapplying again next year, and actually having some type of takeaway. So the end game there was like, how do we provide value to all, make up a number 100 applicants, not just the 5 to 10 that received, scholarships in these really highly competitive application structures. Now, again, a lot of these campaigns, we're providing funding to everybody, different story. But then over time, and this is kind of where I want to get into today, we started to hear these really terrible horror stories. So for example, we'd have organizations that reach out to us and say, hey, we just found out that we went through an entire scholarship selection process just to find out that a bunch of our committee members actually knew the applicants. And coincidentally, those are the ones that receive funding. So like there's something there that's not fair, it's not compliant. How do we blind the data? We heard even worse stories of, so for example, hey, we collect our applications through attachments, through email. A whole bunch of them went to our spam filter. So we actually sat down and we awarded scholarship funding to high school seniors And then 3 months later, we had people following up with us saying, hey, what's the status of my application? And sure enough, we're sitting here saying, well, we never actually got it. We found it in your spam filter. You never even got included in the review process. So those are the experiences that led us to kind of set up and build Reviewr as an online platform to run the entire scholarship. I guess I call it a life cycle from start to finish. So everything from the intake of the applications, obviously the management functionality, the review and selection processes, and then a lot of the post-scholar awarding and kind of deliverable processes as well. Obviously with one or two main goals in mind. Number one is to help streamline a lot of the operations. There's so many moving parts, and we feel that you should be focusing on your mission and your values, less so focusing on downloading documents and emails and spreadsheets. But much more important is that you only make up 1/3 of the program. So the review committee members and the applicants, how do we just elevate their experience as well, in hopes that some of those things trickle down to more compliance, better review processes, more fair and accurate selections, things like that. So with that said, I'm going to jump now into kind of our first topic today, which is going to be the proof of process. Now, again, I'll kind of run through kind of the core premise behind this, and then off to the right on my screen, or maybe it's the left for you, I do have a Reviewr pulled up, and we'll kind of review at a high level kind of what this could translate into, again, either in Reviewr or in some of your existing platforms or processes. So number one, what is a proof of process? Again, I think it's a very highly underrated aspect that should be included in all scholarships. There's different extremes and different examples that you can go into. But at the end of the day, it's a public statement that you're going to say, hey, look, if you're applying for funding through our organization, this is the process that you're going to go through. It absolutely sets expectations. It helps kind of hold everybody accountable. But fast forwarding to the end of the program, I'm hopefully this hasn't happened to anybody here, but I've heard it hundreds and hundreds of times where an applicant's parent, or if it's a K through 12 program, or the applicant themselves calls up and says, hey, I was told I didn't receive scholarship funding, but I know one of the other applicants and they did, and there's just no physical way that they were more deserving than I was. And so without being able to kind of go back and say, well, we told you this is what the process looked like, and things like that, it puts ourselves into potentially some legal challenges, but also just really sticky situations that we just don't want to be in. It also helps kind of raise the overall brand presence and reputation of the program. So there's kind of 4 elements that I like to see in a proof of process. Again, each one of those 4 elements can get really deep, or it can just be at a very high level, like, hey, here's the 4 things that we're going to include. Number one is just an outline of like what the dates and deadlines look like. That way we can kind of set expectations, timelines, things of that nature. Number 2 is going to be outlining of the actual submission process. That's also a great use case for the applicants to kind of pre-prepare what's going to be necessary for them. That way they can start working on things, gathering some of those external resources like references or transcripts, so not fighting different types of dates and deadlines. Probably the most important aspect of this will be the review process. So and we'll get more into the examples here, but kind of setting the expectation of like, you're going to get review with this type of score sheet. You're going to have this many review members evaluating you, things like that. And then also, if you were to get selected for a scholarship, like what are those next steps? So we'll kind of dive through a couple of those examples one at a time. Dates and deadlines is actually quite simple. And again, this overall isn't a very complex concept, right? A proof of process. It's all about protecting the house, but also setting the expectations. So you don't have to go too deep into this, but at a high level, there's probably like 6 or 7 dates that we want people to be aware of. When applications are opening and closing, when the review process starts. It could be, depending on what your review process looks like, the different stages of it. So internal kind of vetting and selection processes, multi-phase review, if you're doing interviews, and then, of course, when are the announcements going to be made? Now, I do want to kind of preface this by saying that if we are going to outline these dates and deadlines, that you need to stick to them. Now, there are circumstances where you can extend deadlines, and if you do that, we just got to make sure there's announcements being sent out to everybody that deadlines were extended. That way, we can kind of reset expectations, as well as update your proof of process. But number 2 is that if we're going to have firm announcement dates and things like that, that we actually make those announcements roughly within that time frame. Because otherwise what's going to happen is you're going to have an overwhelming number of applicants reaching back out to you and say, hey, you said that we'd be notified on Friday. It's Saturday morning. Where are those announcements at? It seems silly, but we've seen so much support from some of our clients that haven't kind of followed through with it. So go to the extreme with the proof of process that you're comfortable with, and then you can always add more to it in future years. Now, I think the real nuts and bolts of the approval process will be both the expectations for the submission side of things, as well as the evaluation side of things. So I would even get as deep into saying details on the portal that's being used. Believe it or not, we've seen a pretty decent reduction in volume if the applicants don't have confidence in the platform and the tools that are being leveraged to power the scholarships. So, for example, if your scholarship program is, hey, fill out one of our fillable Word docs, or hey, send us an email with a bunch of attachments, or hey, go use this survey tool, the confidence level from the applicant starts to fall. Not only is it potentially a very, I guess, cumbersome process for them, so there's a barrier, but they're looking for things like, hey, is this an actual dedicated scholarship platform? Are they compliant? So for us, we talk about SOC 2 Type 2 compliance. I'll share this back out. That's something to maybe write down to make sure that whatever platform you're currently using is SOC 2 compliant. If I'm submitting confidential or private information, I don't think we need to be collecting things like social security number, maybe not yet. I know there's all these FAFSA things that are going on, but if I'm going to be submitting those deliverables to you, how do I know that my data is not being sold? How do I know that it's not sitting on somebody's desk in a binder somewhere? Things like that. How do I know that I'm not just submitting to a generalized email account that's shared by 6 different people? Or we can get super deep into this and say, hey, if I'm submitting things like references and transcripts or really deep personal information, and you go to review that information, who is the people reviewing it? Can they actually download it? Can they store it on their own personal hard drives? Like, once this program wraps up, what happens with my data? So these are all things that we have to be thinking about. Again, experience, but also it does elevate the volume of these programs as well. Kind of a couple other items we'll kind of get into here too is if you have other, I guess, individuals who are participating in the review team that are not part of your staff, things like NDAs, right? They seem like small things, but I think the applicants are just looking for confidence. The next thing that we're going to look at is the selection experience. And I think this is the absolute most critical part to this because, I'm putting myself in the position of an applicant. If I'm applying for any type of funding, I want to know that as soon as I press that submit button, that I'm going to get the fair, non-biased opportunity that I deserve. And so what that typically means is like, hey, when you're applying to a scholarship with us, we're going to ensure that you're going to get reviewed by X number of review members. We're going to do an auto distribution. So those individuals that are reviewing you are at random. We're going to have them fill out an NDA is not the right word, but like a conflict of interest form. So if the applicant or if the review committee member does have a conflict of interest, that they won't review them and that you will get reassigned back out to somebody else. Also, our review process isn't just going to be a bunch of people sitting around a table saying, yep, they're my best friend or they're my favorite. We're actually going to be leveraging a rubric with quantitative scoring where the math that gets tabulated will actually outline and put out the results. You can also get into things like the blinding of data. So not only are we going to ensure that you're going to get reviewed by X number of people at random, but we also can ensure that when you get reviewed, that things like your name or your email or any of your personal information is being blinded from that judge's point of view. So not only are they filling out a quantitative score sheet, but they're also going to be basing their review process off of the merits of your application, not who you are as a person, your demographics, or your background. Again, we'll get more into how to actually power these things, but that's more of, again, the proof of process. And then the last thing, which is pretty short and simple, is the post-scholarship process. So, when are announcements being given out? What does that process look like? We have some of our clients at Reviewr that are actually super transparent, where when programs wrap up, they actually will reopen the system and say, hey, whether or not you were selected or not, you can log back in and you can actually physically view the score sheets that were filled out about you. That way you can either A, take it for some type of self-development and growth, or B, just to show that, hey, not only did we say you're going to go through this process, but here's the proof that you actually did. So that's a polarizing conversation. Obviously, it does open up maybe a can of worms for some of you, but I think it is kind of a nice way to bookend. Hey, here's the process, and then boom, here's the process that we actually can ensure that you went through. Any questions on that? Toss them into the meeting chat. Now we'll kind of get into some real examples here. But the next thing we're going to talk about, again, I am keeping an eye on the calendar, and I'll send this back out after, is the safeguarding of the applicant information. So what we're really going to talk about here is like, what does the ideal application workflow and structure look like? But because, we are talking about funding opportunities, we are collecting private information. So how do we ensure that we are safeguarding it and it's being safe and private, and it is a top priority for us? So first and foremost, from just a pure usability perspective, I'm going to kind of walk through Reviewr here as well and how we do this. everything should be driven by profiles. So we don't want to see a bunch of moving parts. If you think through a scholarship program, you've got people, we have submission forms. I say forms plural because it's possible that you have people submitting additional deliverables in the future. You might have forms being submitted on behalf of people. So I've seen like principal forms being submitted. I've seen parent information being submitted. You have communication going on. You've got review and selection processes going on. You got multiple phases of review. And so, we can, hey, we have our application process, which is safe and secure. But then once applications come in, now we're using email, we're using spreadsheets, now we're downloading your documents. Those aren't, right? And so we got to think through all the moving parts of a scholarship program and then kind of lump them into what I call a concept called a profile. And that's what is obviously being safeguarded. So all data, especially personal information, has to be encrypted both in transit and at rest. So there's things to look out for in contracting. You also need to make sure that the processes are up to date with current global standards. So I think most people on the call today are from the US, but bigger picture, GDPR, FERPA compliance, California Personal Information Acts. Those are ever adapting compliance structures and rules that are in place. I don't believe that you have the time or the bandwidth to always be up to date and current with what that looks like. So why don't you leave that to an expert platform like, say, for example, Reviewr, where our staff is monitoring in real time kind of these conversations that are happening and getting ahead of it. Again, you're also potentially looking for things like audits and certifications with whatever vendor you decide to use. Make sure that they are kind of using the gold standard SOC 2 Type 2, get a report from them, kind of look into if they've been audited before, penetration testing. Very not fun, not exciting, not sexy conversations to have, but at its core, it's absolutely critical. And then also just know best practices. Again, whatever platform you decide to use, once your contracting is up or once the program ends, like what happens with that data? Like who actually ends up owning it? Because number one is that a lot of your information is in there, but number two is that you have a lot of applicant information. Can they get things back out to them? Because again, at the end of the day, the applicant should own their own content and you should own the content about the program. The next thing I want to talk about, and I'm going to do this kind of in real time, is the concept called references. And this could theoretically apply to things like transcripts as well. Although if it's a formal transcript or an official transcript, it can't happen this way. Some of our clients are also collecting things like parent letters and forms or things externally. So the concept behind a reference collection process. Number one is I love the concept of references. Nothing speaks more about the quality of the candidate than the words from somebody else. With that said, if you've ever been requested to write a reference, it is extremely complex. Number one is that you're being asked at the very, very last minute. Number two is you have to sit down from scratch and write a letter. And number three is that no references are created equal. And what I mean by that is if I was asked to write a reference about my wife, it will not be as good as what she writes about me. It's not that I don't love her to death. I'm just not a very good writer. And so is that a fair reflection of her as the candidate, or is it more of a reflection on me as the person writing the reference? So at Reviewr, what we like to see happening is instead a concept called a reference template. And I'm going to walk you through this here in just a second. So the idea behind a reference template is number one is that the reference get notified right away. So if you're writing a reference on behalf of somebody else, you're not going to wait to the very last minute. You're going to be notified at the very front end of the process. That way you can get your ducks aligned and begin processing it. Number two is instead of writing down and writing something from scratch, we're going to ask you, what are like the 3 to 5 things that you want every reference to speak about on behalf of the candidate? That way, the reference can stay highly focused. There's a lower barrier for them to submit it. But number two is that the data becomes very consistent at this point. When your team sits down to go through a review and selection process and you're looking at the reference information, those 3 to 5 questions are the same for absolutely everybody. So you're no longer comparing apples to oranges, it's apples across the board. So we'll kind of take a look at what that looks like right now. The last thing is the high-level applicant workflow. So number one is you've got a really strong brand. You should probably leverage it. So most of these campaigns should start with your web presence, either a link on there or embedding a tool on there, but let's send traffic to your site. Again, it builds up reputation. It helps ease confidence levels of the applicants, outline the proof of process. If you are doing some type of eligibility or if you're offering multiple scholarships, let's build in some type of workflow that help guides applicants, where they belong. You'd be shocked at how many times scholarship providers offer multiple opportunities, but the applicants have no freaking clue which ones they're even eligible for. So how do we kind of make this a more accessible process to the applicants? Collect the personal information about the applicants. just because you're collecting data doesn't mean that you have to do something with it from the review team's perspective. So think about that as, what am I collecting for our own record keeping, but then also what am I collecting for the actual selections? I love storytelling. So obviously you're going to want to collect information about education or whatever it is that the scholarship is for. But let's capture something personal about the applicants, personal stories, achievements, community impact, volunteer, the non-tangibles, right? At this point in time, grades are not a very telling story about the qualification of a candidate. I've heard so many great stories of people who didn't get great grades that went on to do great things. I'm sure all of us have. So how do we let that personality shine? And you know what? It may not even be in the form of an essay. It might even be a video testimonial, which also from a marketing perspective, when you go to celebrate the awards, or sorry, to celebrate the scholarship, how cool marketing collateral is it to have that video story about the applicants themselves? And then we kind of get into document management. So, references, transcripts, photos, videos, whatever documents that you have to collect. So let me catch my breath and let's run into Reviewr. So with our platform, again, I'm not trying to showcase Reviewr here. What I want to do is showcase what is everything we just spoke about look like in practicality. So again, you would use your existing web presence as the main entry point, and then most of our clients will link from their websites to what I call a microsite. Now, the microsites are extremely important for a couple of reasons. Number one is it serves as a middleman between your web presence and then the scholarship kind of process or workflow, but also allows you to reiterate dates, deadlines, expectation. If I scroll through here, we have a bunch of downloads, a bunch of resources that we can give applicants before they even begin the process. This is also where you could literally have a little section about, a little disclaimer of, hey, if you're applying for our scholarship, here's what the process will look like, right? That's that proof of process that I talked about earlier. You heard me say the word profile probably quite a bit. Again, you don't want to use any type of online infrastructure for just one portion of the program and then divert back to using paper, email, spreadsheets, downloading of documents for everything else. So think about within your own internal programs, what are all the moving parts and how can we centralize them into one spot? So for us, it's that concept called profiles. So a lot of times the applicants will come in, they'll put in who they are. So first name, last name, email, password, very, very simple. But then once they kind of progress on from there, this gives us the ability to save. They can log out, they can come back later. It gives you some great tracking capabilities. So humans will do two things. One is they're not going to read. So all of your really important deadlines that I just talked about, even that proof of process, they're going to skip past it. It's just good to have it. But number two is they're going to procrastinate, right? And so how do we provide visibility to you as a scholarship provider, about, where you're at today, how many applications have you received of your applications, where are they in the process? Are they started but not finished? Do they save, midway through? Who are they? Send them reminder messages, without knowing what platforms you're currently using on this call. Typically our clients see a 35% increase in volume just from that alone. I'm going to talk more about that reference concept in a little bit, but if I introduce this really unique and great way to collect references, now you're probably thinking about, okay, great. So now my references are coming in externally. How do I know who's been requested to write a reference? What's their progress percentage? How do I send them reminders? So again, this is where that concept of a profile becomes so important. And then long-term, right? How are scholarship applicants submitting back to you acceptance letters, where the funds should be dispersed? Do you want to get, 6-month updates from them? How's that going to get submitted to you? So with Reviewr, they just log back in and they add those deliverables. So let's take a look at a high-level application form. So there's two things that I love to see right away. So again, proof of process. But then once these scholarships actually begin, if you have multiple categories or if you have eligibility and or multiple scholarship opportunities, we'd love to see what I call an eligibility quiz. Now, again, that's probably an internal term. We don't want to use the word quiz. But basically what we're saying here is, look, when you begin the application process, here's what the eligibility looks like. Here's all the different scholarships that we provide. But why don't you do this? Why don't you fill out this little questionnaire? And the system will in real time read these answers and say, hey, because your parents served in the US military, or because you were determined by the court that you're an emancipated minor, we actually have these opportunities for you. And so the system will read that in real time and say, look, here's the scholarship that you're eligible for, and it allows the applicant from there at that point to pick and choose which ones they want to actually apply to. There is a school foundation that we work with that does 96 different scholarships. And so, as you can imagine, if you're applying for a scholarship, you're not going to know which of those 96 you're even eligible for. So within Reviewr, the system will kick out and say, hey, of these 96, here's the ones that you're actually eligible for. Which ones do you want to apply for now? Or maybe you just give out one scholarship, but your scholarship has very clear deadlines and requirements. The system would say, hey, based on what you just filled out, unfortunately, you don't meet the requirements. You can maybe push them to other resources, but it stops them in their tracks. That way, we're not wasting their time, right? Submitting a bunch of stuff that they can't even apply for. But then B, we're saving you a whole heck of a lot of time when you get into like the review and selection process, knowing that every application that you received actually was eligible for the campaign. From there, we get kind of deep into the actual application process. So I'm not going to get too deep into Reviewr. Ultimately, if you can dream it up, our submission processes can power it. Who are you? Drop downs, checkboxes, essays, file uploads, you name it. But the general idea here is that we're collecting personal information in a very safe, secure, compliant way. The main goal here is the applicants feel comfortable. They're not concerned about losing of information. They're not concerned about trying to figure out how to save a fillable PDF into a Word document. They're focusing on the content creation, right? These are important campaigns. So how do we keep them hyper focused on what matters most? As far as some of the more robust data collection goes, most of our essays or scholarships that we work with are text-based. So if you have essay questions, you can do character limitations, you can do drop downs, you can do file uploads. If you do have essays with character limitations, it shows you in real time, where you're at, how many additional characters you have. The systems are all, adaptable. So based off of what scholarship they choose, additional questions can appear. So each one of those scholarships can have hyper unique workflows without having to use a bunch of different tools to power it. It's kind of all baked into one, what I call visibility workflow. As far as file uploads go, which we'll kind of get into next, Reviewr can take in 131 different file types, regardless of what platform you decide to use. File management is critical. So for a couple of reasons. Number one is collecting files isn't hard, but doing something with them is. So at least in our platform, every single file, photos, videos, PowerPoints, PDFs, Word docs, you name it, they get embedded. So when your team and your review team comes in to actually look at them, you can physically view the files in Reviewr without having to download them, go use other tools, come back later. More importantly, though, is that we can control security privileges. So no, we can't prevent somebody from your team or from your review committees from taking screenshots, right? Like that's just a way it is. We can't prevent them from taking a screenshot of the documents. We can, however, prevent them from downloading things. Or maybe you want to take, I'm going to make up a simple number because it's end of the week. If you have 10 file uploads submitted, but you just want 2 of them to be reviewed by the team, you can hide those other 8 so that way they're internal use only. So it allows you to have really, really kind of deep control over not just what you're collecting, but also how it's being accessed, who it's being accessed by, when it's being accessed, things like that. Again, all mapping back to proof of process. The last thing that I'm going to talk about here again is that reference process. Yes, I am 100% biased because I think this is a really slick feature that we have, but this is without a doubt the right way of collecting what I call supplemental forms. So just because we're talking about references, it does not have to be just a reference. It could be transcripts if they're unofficial. It could be additional deliverables being submitted on behalf of your applicants by somebody else. So it could be from their parents or from a guidance counselor. Making up examples here. But the way that this works is basically the applicant would put in the name and email of who is submitting that additional deliverable. I would change this a little bit and I maybe put it on like the second page of the form. That way it happens right away. But then that person gets an email notification that says, dear Tony, Kyle's asked you submit a reference on his behalf. Click here to do so. Tony then simply clicks on a link, is sent to a page with a form. Again, we don't want to do reference letters. We want reference templates. They answer the 3 to 5 questions. They submit, boom, they're done. Now in real time, that reference gets automatically attached back to my profile where you and your team can physically view it. The applicants can come in, they can see if their references are done or not. Again, you can hide the data so they can't see the content of the reference. They just know, did Tony do it or not? Otherwise, they have to do their own follow-ups and their own reminder. So, in a future conversation, if this is something that's interesting to you, we can either do a whole another webinar just on that topic alone, or I'd be happy to kind of walk through this with you. Kind of moving on is the submission process. So once they actually submit their applications, the journey may not end. So for some of you, you might allow them to make updates or edits up until certain deadlines. If it's a multi-phase program, you can actually unlock and add additional deliverables as they go on. The next piece of the puzzle, without a doubt, is the most important aspect of a scholarship. I think so many of us focus on the marketing of the scholarships and the websites and the submission forms because that's what people see. But at the end of the day, it's such a small component as far as the bigger picture goes. Yes, we want to make sure we save you a whole bunch of time. But at the end of the day, we have people who are applying for extremely important processes, make it simple for them and make it fair. So when it gets into the review process, the main goal here is how do we create an impartial review process that's based on the merits of the application, not who they are. So this is a tough task because it largely depends on the volume of your program. So number one is if it's a smaller scholarship, there's probably no concerns around having your entire team reviewing all of your applications. But if it is a bigger program, how do you divvy out your submissions to your committees and to your teams in a way that allows them to stay hyper-focused and not overwhelmed? Believe it or not, this is a real example. We work with the Scholarship Foundation that prior to using Reviewr, they had 900 applications, and they actually asked a team of 9 people to review all 900. So do some high-level math for me. Tell me how long it'll take you to read 900 essays. And then also tell me how you can differentiate the first 20 essays versus the last 900, right? Like it's not physically possible. So how do we kind of create these processes where we're ensuring that the applicants are getting the fair number of reviews that they deserve without overwhelming the review teams? That way, when they go to review the applications, each one gets the attentive details that it requires. We can kind of get into how we can actually do that. I like to leverage automation to an extent. So a lot of times we'll take these programs and how do we kind of break them into segments? So if you have multiple scholarships, that's one way of doing it, where you have certain committees per scholarship. You can break it down to multiple phases. So phase number one is like an internal review and selection process by just high-level vetting people, moving it on to phase two, which would use like a score sheet with a bigger team. And then phase three might be like interviews or like the board, voting on their top 10. That way we're kind of, weeding people out, but then also, changing up the review process as we go. Again, I love randomization. So if you do have a larger scholarship program, instead of trying to break things into groupings or committees, why don't we just say, hey, let's just give it to our entire team, but let's just say nobody reviews more than 15. Or how do we say, nobody reviews more than 15, yet every applicant has to get reviewed by 3 different eyes. So again, obviously Reviewr can power those, but that's kind of where my mindset goes of doing randomization is how do we kind of lower the barrier for your committees and for your teams. The next step of that is creating an objective selection environment. And there's kind of 3 to 4 key components that go into that. So number one is just because you collected information doesn't mean that the review team has to see that. The reason why I say it that way is my mind first goes to like the blinding of PII. So, who are you, demographic details, identifying information. That way the review team isn't making decisions off of the person, they're making decisions off of the content. But just because it's non-critical or non-PII doesn't mean you should still not review it. So what I mean by that is a lot of the data you might be collecting for your scholarships is great for bookkeeping and archiving and for tracking purposes. But if the review team isn't going to look at that piece of content and directly use it for the selection process, just don't show it to them. Again, it opens the door up to potential compliance things that you don't want to deal with. And number two is I go back to like the review side of things. Maybe just with the way things work out, they're going to have to review a couple hundred submissions. So if that is the case, how do we kind of show them only what they need so they can see hyper focus? And again, using a dedicated scholarship management software goes a long way in these things. I don't believe anybody on this call wants to have to take all of your applications, make multiple copies of them, download them, export them, put them into spreadsheets, put them onto Google Drive, send it to the committees, get spreadsheets back, recompile them, et cetera, right? Like it's 2024, like there's got to be a better way of doing these types of things. And then the last piece of that puzzle is using data-driven scoring. Now, by no means do score sheets tell the whole story. With that said, score sheets absolutely should be used to power informed decision-making. So the idea behind a score sheet is that your review team can look at the content of the applications. You want to maybe map certain sections of your scholarship application to certain scoring criteria. I'm going to show as well as share after this an example score sheet. But if you're collecting education information, have a very simple question about, on a scale of 1 to 10, and you can weight this too, right? So if your organization has a higher weighting on things like volunteer opportunities or community involvement, you can weight that higher than GPA. Like absolutely, I think you should. But the idea here is that you have a section that maps to education, a section that maps to volunteer opportunities, a section that maps to personal storytelling, right? That way that the review committee can very focused read through the applications while filling out their score sheets at the exact same time. Number two is hopefully whatever vendor or platform that you're using has automated results. And so that way you and your team are not crunching numbers and looking at the scores. It kind of kicks it out on your own. You can also potentially automate some of the selection criteria. So if you are offering, say, for example, a certain point value to applicants with a certain GPA or a certain number of volunteer hours or a certain location, at least in Reviewr, you can assign point values to the submission form that automatically pulls into the scorecard. So your scorecard might be 15 criteria, but 5 of those 15 are automatically filled out on behalf, right, based on the application form. That way the judging committee is just looking at those final 10. So again, lowering the time it requires the review team to stay focused. I would say that outside of quantitative scoring, if they are leveraging the reference requests as part of the score sheets, if you're watching video essays or if you're reading essays, the idea is to also make it super simple for them to actually physically view that content while filling out their score sheets, not having to leave a tool, come back later, handwrite notes, remember what they filled out. So we'll look at that here. So again, the high level selection workflow, number one, create some type of grouping structure. Take all of your submissions and how do we kind of break it into bite-sized pieces for the review team. Ideally, how do you automatically assign those submissions to your review teams? Blind the information, right? Like just there's no point to have them reviewing PII. Leverage mathematic-based scorecards. So the system says, hey, based off of the score sheets, here's the results. By no means do those results mean that they're going to stay that way. At least allows you to have deliberations or data-driven discussion making. And if you are doing like a multi-phase program, like what does that process look like of narrowing things down, advancing them to the next phase? Because it's highly likely that you're going to have different selection teams and criteria per phase, right? Your vetting phase is more of a thumbs up, thumbs down. The round two is going to use a score sheet. And then obviously when you're interviewing somebody, you're going to be using a totally different score sheet than something that was based off of like essays or references. So in practice, what does this look like? So in Reviewr, number one is that we want to make sure that you have some type of command center, right? So when you log in, how do you have a pulse of what's going on? So how many submissions have you received? How many have been reviewed? Like where are they in the grand scheme of things? I'm going to leave it there. There's so many, obviously, as everybody in this call knows, there's so many moving parts to managing a scholarship that we're not going to get into today. But as far as the review process goes, there's a couple kind of critical pieces. So number one is that you have to, again, take these scholarship applications and give them to your team. So ideally, you'll have some type of security in place where you can control who actually has access to those applications. Once you've done that, the next piece is to create those buckets. So I tried to create an example for you based off of a real client of ours that has two different kind of components. Number one is that they offer multiple scholarships. So with that, they have different committees per scholarship. But number two is it's multi-phase. So once you go through the internal review process, you go to an interview phase and then a final review of the board. So in a perfect situation, when your applicants are filling out their application forms, there's some type of logic that says, hey, you know what? Kyle is applying to the Lennox Wilder Scholarship. Therefore, as soon as Kyle applies, let's put him into a bucket with all the other candidates to that scholarship. Again, if you only offer one scholarship, you flip that. You say, hey, as soon as they submit, let's put them automatically into the phase one bucket. And then from there, they'll move on to the phase two bucket, the phase three bucket, et cetera. I'm trying to think of use cases based off of some of the names that I see here. Maybe it's a multi-location based program, multi-chapter based program, multi-need based program. Those are the types of parameters I'm looking for. So again, the system will read the form and say, hey, based off of this choice, let's start to auto-categorize people in some way, shape, or form. Now, in my example here, let's presume that we have the Lennox Wilder Scholarship full of a bunch of applicants. The next step is that we have to give those applicants to a team to review. So what we'll end up doing is off to the right, I got Simon, Paula, Mark, and Judge Judy. Whenever they come into the platform, they're only going to see the Lennox Wilder scholarships. Now, if your team is in charge of multiple scholarships or multiple categories or multiple buckets, as you can see in my example, that's also great. So when they log in, they're going to see the Lennox Wilder Scholarship, the Carson Kirby Scholarship, the Brooke Marlowe. So it's all about controlling access levels. Now, this is where things get super cool, is that just because they're in a grouping, what if we want to leverage some of those automations I talked about? So I click Manage Assignments, and then it actually shows you a listing of every applicant in that bucket, the number of people who are supposed to review them, and who those people are. So we have complete visibility on who is reviewing who, when, and how. from here, I can start to leverage automation. So in this example, like let's just say my proof of process said that if you apply for our scholarship, you're going to get reviewed exactly 5 times. I can just press each submission gets 5 judges, and then the system automatically gives them 5 submissions at complete random levels, while also keeping an eye on the workloads. And so that way, not one review member is getting a bunch of people and another review member gets 2. It'll try to evenly distribute out, assuming that the math makes sense. I talked earlier on about the scorecards, where a lot of our clients will have some type of question that says, hey, is there a conflict of interest, yes or no? And if they choose yes, number one is you have to know. So a trigger that would say, hey, so-and-so has a conflict of interest with so-and-so. And then 2 is you can jump in here and say, okay, well, just because my judge, Mark here, was assigned to Gabrielle, Leslie, Richard, and Sheldon, I know for a fact that Mark is golfing buddies with Leslie's dad. So let's go ahead and unchoose Leslie's name here, and then we'll choose Barney. So we overrode those auto assignments with a very per person assignment basis. So again, if there's questions about, toss them in the chat, but I'll kind of keep moving on. So great, we collected all these applications, we automatically sorted them, we filtered them, we put them in these buckets, we assigned them out to our review teams at random. We probably also behind the scenes said, hey, you know, let's blind this, and that from the review teams as well, because we don't want them to see that. Now let's do a review. So when the review team goes to access their applications, again, hopefully they're not going to things like Dropbox and SurveyMonkey and all these different types of tools, right, to access your applications. What they instead would see is a menu system. So we want to give them expectations because, again, just like your applicants, your review team A won't read. B, they're going to procrastinate and wait to the very last minute. So we want to make sure that A, have expectations, and B, gives you the tracking capability to know who are my judges, are they done or not? If they're not done, let's send them reminder messages. And then, of course, from here, they can start to open up their submissions. By no means is Reviewr blurry. What's actually happening here is me trying to show you that, hey, if you don't want to show the review team people's names or demographic details, it just doesn't show up. So the review team has a menu. Obviously, it's becoming lunchtime now, so I'm thinking about menus already. But the review team will just see a list of who they're supposed to review. They open it up, and then they get a split screen. So again, I don't care. I mean, obviously, I want you to use Reviewr, but whatever platform that you decide to use or whatever your process looks like, this is critical. We want your review team to have a one-stop shop for all review processes. So they will see a split screen on the left, who the applicant is. So here's that kind of virtual binder of the application process. And then off to the right is the selection tool. You're also going to notice that it's independent. So the review team should be able to side by side scroll through the application, review the score sheet, go to the attachments, go to the forms, etc., while filling out their scorecard. We also want to make sure that the scorecards aren't overly complex. So in this example, I don't love asking judges to input scores on like a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 for 5. I instead like them to review it off of like a word. So good, great, ugly, poor, below average, average, great, exemplary, right? That way the judge is actually thinking through the content and the quality, not just some type of random point value. With that said, there can be point values behind the scenes assigned to those words. And that's actually what's happening here. So the review committee can side by side, fill it out, they'll answer exemplary or whatever their answers are. In this example, we're asking about the education or scholastic achievements. We're asking about extracurricular activities. We're asking about leadership roles. Again, it may not be a leadership-based scholarship, but like, have they shown leadership responsibilities? Have they taken on complex tasks? Have they led teams? What is their volunteer look like? Maybe not necessarily volunteer hours, but like what type of community impact does this applicant have? Read through the surveys or read through the essays. If it's a video essay, like A, like, how well thought out was it? B, like how well written was it? And then C, like how much personality shine through, like what type of storyteller are they? And then the last piece says the score sheet. So behind the scenes, at least Reviewr will auto tabulate those results. So as soon as the judge is done scoring, the system will actually kick out kind of a ranking tool that would actually say, here's a list of all of the applicants. Here's how they were scored from a scale from like 1 to 10. It gives you total scores, average scores, which I'm going to get to here. And then it basically auto ranks them. So the system will tell you from high to low, look, here's all my applicants, Leslie, Sheldon, Richard. Here's who judged them. Here's their totals. Here's their averages. And very easily, we can just advance them from phase 1 to phase 2, or from phase 2 to the interview phase, et cetera. So I do want to show one more quick thing, and that's that reference that I talked about earlier. So once the references get submitted, so this would be like your menu of as an admin looking at applicants. You can simply open up an applicant's profile. You see who they are. You can communicate with them. I talked earlier about those file uploads. So every document that gets uploaded to Reviewr, your team and your review committee with their scorecard off to the right can press view and it'll embed the files right smack dab in front of you. So again, that's like photos, videos, PowerPoint, spreadsheets, PDFs, you name it. I'm going to jump up to the top here. So here's how we handle references. So in my use case I'm looking at, I actually have 3 completely separate types of what I call supplemental forms. One's a reference, one's a transcript, and then one's it's just other. So in this example, Ann Perkins was asked to write a reference on behalf of Leslie. So Ann would have got an email notification and clicks on a link, and then Ann goes to a form. So when it gets submitted, I simply press view, and there's that form that Ann filled out. So again, it's who the reference was, what those 3 to 4 questions were. And if you are still having them submit file uploads, you can still view those files directly in the system. So again, what we're basically looking at is a scholarship applicant's profile with who they are, what their application was, what their files were, any external forms submitted on their behalf. And then of course you have your own internal note-taking tools, communication tools, etc. So with that said, I am going to pause here for any questions. Oh, that's a great question, Jennifer. Thank you for asking that. So any tools in place, right, to check for ChatGPT? Stay tuned. We're doing another webinar. It might even be next month that we'll do this one because this is such a common trend right now. So AI, it's everybody's favorite and everybody's least favorite thing to talk about. So number one is in the scholarship provider space, there absolutely is a place for AI. We'll get more of this in a future webinar. From an admin perspective, there's so many things that we can do with AI to make your lives easier. Summarizing of applications, kind of help even do vetting processes based off of like what qualifications make up a good candidate. That's a very polarizing conversation. And that's a request that we've actually gotten from organizations that say, hey, can you just auto evaluate all of my applications based off of AI? Yeah, we definitely can, but is that the right way of doing things? I don't know. That's kind of a question to you. So I'm super excited for that webinar. With that said, yes, there are absolutely tools out there that can read scholarship applications and flag if it's been written by AI or not. On top of that, it'll also tell you like what % of it might be and what the confidence levels look like. So there are some of those things. We can kind of connect about how to do that. There's obviously external vendors that do that, but there's also ways in Reviewr that we are doing that as well. What I will say though, is we've actually heard from some applicants or some organizations that they're allowing candidates to write applications with AI. It just kind of comes down to like what your values are when it comes to applications. If it's more like a Scholastic based one, like it's probably okay. The best way to combat this is videos. So, and I think in general, this is a trend that we're starting to see is instead of saying like, hey, let's write an essay or a paper about why you deserve this scholarship. Instead, it's like, upload a 3 to 5 minute video telling me who you are. Let's let your personality shine through and tell us why you are deserving of it. Again, 3 reasons. Number 1 is I actually feel like from an applicant's perspective, it might be easier. Number 2, I think from the judging committee's perspective, they're looking for these more engaging applications. This can be a very mundane process, right? Like how many essays can we possibly read? So watching these videos is very personal. And then number 3 is at some point when you go to announce who our scholarship recipients were this year, I still think that those videos are such a cool marketing collateral to showcase your audience. The rejecting of files, another great question. So I would actually go further and say not just the rejecting of files and have them resubmitted, but it might be applications themselves. So in Reviewr, there's kind of 2 components. There's a submission component, and then there's the deliverable component, both of which can be sent back for revision to the applicant. So we have status changes because that's actually critical because you need to know, right, like who's been sent back for revisions. And then when they get submitted back to you, who's ready to be reviewed again. But it's also important too to have some type of mechanism in place. Obviously, Reviewr does this where you can track revisions. So when they submit a new document or a new file up, like what was the original, what's the new one, what's been changed? Lots of ways of doing that as well. Engagement on a semi-fixed application pool year-over-year. Yeah, so applicant pool stays largely the same from 1 year to the next. That's just challenging in the sense of you need to freshen up what the application process looks like. So one of the reasons why I love reference requests and videos is that even if the application pool stays the same each year, those references won't. And you can specify that. So the way that would work in Reviewr is you have the applicants who apply, and potentially from one year to the next, you want to carry their information over, because if it is the same applicant pool, a lot of their information won't change. So we don't want them to have to resubmit from scratch, right? That's a barrier that we don't want them to have to go through. So in Reviewr, when they go to fill out their 2024, their 2025 scholarship application, we might say something like, okay, which questions from the prior application do you want to carry over? First name, last name, email, but maybe not address, because that changed. And then on that point, you can then say, okay, this series of questions, even though you applied last year, needs to be resubmitted. And that would be things like the references. It could be the video essays and things like that. So people don't change, but the content being submitted on their behalf absolutely should be changed. Videos in lieu of essays, the blinding of the data. That is very, very true, Sarah. So there's a couple things that we need to do. Is we have to basically create a template that says, when you fill out your scholarship video essay, don't say your name, don't say who you are. With that said, like if somebody can visually recognize them, like you're 100% going to run into challenges. So that's maybe where we narrow it down for the finalists, and not everybody fills out a video, just the last individuals. That was also something I didn't talk about today that I probably should have, is when it comes to like document or data collection in general, like if you have 150 submissions, I'm just making up a number, maybe not all 150 need to submit headshots, right? So why don't we just wait until the last 10 finalists, and then they're the ones that submit the headshot. So within Reviewr, you can control which deliverables are being requested by which people based off of those workflows. Another thing that you can do is we can strip out the video file itself and just do audio. So an audio instead, where it's still the similar concept, right? It's a video essay. You'll be able to tell the difference between like them reading something versus them actually speaking, because it's not scripted out. And that way you are still kind of blinding the visualizations of them. Yeah, the grammar or spelling errors. So there's a couple of things that we can do about that. Ultimately, almost every modern web browser has it baked in. We just have to ensure that the application form or whatever tool that you're using can actually leverage it. So yeah, Reviewr absolutely does allow for the built-in web browser. We don't have our own native grammar check. There's integrations with like Grammarly and different types of tools that we can definitely explore. Tips to ensure that applicants receive all information around the submission process. So I might ask for a bit more clarity to that. What I read by that is you have some type of proof of process or deliverables that you want to ensure that the applicants see before they begin the submission process or through it. So there's two things I would say. Number one is in 2024, you cannot rely on emails. There's a severe pandemic around or epidemic around emails going to spam. So what needs to happen is that there has to be on the website or some type of web presence, a clear outline of like, hey, here are resources, here's a sample application form that they can receive in advance through a mobile interface, not through email transmission. Number two is a lot of times in our submission process, the first few pages of the application form are not going to be application questions. It's communication from you to them with like a checkbox that says, yes, I read this. And then once they check it, they move on to the next page. So that might be like saying, hey, here's our proof of process. Do you agree to it? Or terms and conditions. It could be eligibility criteria. It could be dates and deadlines, but all the information that you're referring to, put in the submission form. And that way they obviously can't get to the next page until they at least review it. So can't guarantee they're going to read it, but we kind of force their hand a little bit. So a question that came in around like word count limitations on essays and short answers. So we at Reviewr actually prefer to do character limitations, not word. I don't think there's any real reason that there's one that's better than the other. We just chose to go character limitations. And so the way that works is basically in the text box itself, it'll show them how many characters are potential that can be filled out, like what the max is. In real time, it counts down so the applicants can like start typing and see how many they have remaining. I think characters is the trend that people are going towards for that reason itself. On a file upload perspective, you could also theoretically do size limitations as well as file type limitations. That's where things get a bit more complex, is like if you're doing like a Word document or a PDF upload that has to be a certain number of characters or words, we can't read the contents within it, but we can read the size of it. So that'd be maybe one of the benefits of saying, hey, instead of uploading a Word doc of your essay, type it directly into a platform like Reviewr. It's also nice because they can save, they can log out, they can come back later. It'll auto save, so that way that we can ensure that they're not losing their information midway through. Signature document. Yes. Hey, Alex, great question. So a couple pieces coming to mind for signatures. Number one is that there's obviously e-signature. That can be from both the applicant's perspective, or if it's a required signature from somebody else. So either on the last page of the application before submitting, they either agree to something or they do an e-signature, or that's that supplemental form feature that's being used for references. So it actually would trigger like a notification to the person that has to do the signature, and they can either A, do an e-signature, or they can physically print it off, sign it, and then upload it back into Reviewr. That's also where we have those attachments. So I don't want to get too deep in this now. This might be a great conversation for us to have. But basically what ends up happening is after they submit, or it could be a signature prior to receiving funding, they would add their own supplemental form, which is it's called a signature page. So it's actually external from the application. It's a signature page. And again, you would either do e-signature, or they would actually physically sign something and then upload it back into the platform. All right. Well, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Really appreciate everybody's time today, and looking forward to either connecting offline about your programs, or if there's anything specific that you want to talk about, I'm here.